In this video, we want to introduce and start to analyze the possibility that firms can charge more than one price. So that's generally known as price discrimination. In this video, we'll talk about sort of the logic behind price discrimination and a type of price discrimination. And then in the next video, we'll analyze a couple more common types of price discrimination. But the whole logic here is if a firm can charge more than one price and can charge customers different prices, why would they do that? Who gets what price? All sorts of things like that will be addressed in these next two videos. So the logic behind why a firm might want to charge multiple prices, how price discrimination works, all boils down to something called consumer surplus. So a sort of textbook definition, consumer surplus is the value consumers get from a good but do not have to pay for. So for example, let's say that I asked you, how much would you value a 1 week vacation to Hawaii? And you gave me a number of $8,000. I'm just making up numbers here. And I could give you that vacation for $5,000. So your value is 8. I could sell it to you for 5, exactly how you want it. Your consumer surplus would be $3,000 in that case. It's the difference between how much you value the good at and what you actually have to pay for it. So, you go and you buy almost anything you buy, we can make the assumption that because you're free will buying it, you value it at the price you were charged for it or more. And in lots of cases, more. So you buy a particular car, you buy, a gallon of milk, whatever it happens to be, you value it at least the price they're charging you because you, of your own free will, chose to buy that. So consumer surplus is the difference between your true value, what you really value that at, and what we're going to charge you for it, or what you're paying for it in terms of a price. So you can hopefully start to see how price discrimination, we're going to try and capture as a firm some of that consumer surplus. So let me give you some a sense of what consumer surplus looks like graphically, and then we'll come back to sort of how do we capture that. So here's a demand curve. We've talked about demand, we've talked about estimating demand, all these different things. If this firm picks a price, so in this particular example, I'm assuming that they're picking a price of $2. So price equals $2. At a price of $2, if I go straight across $2 to the demand curve, 4 units will be bought and sold. So total expenses on those 4 units is this red area down here. So total expenditures is $2 times 4 units bought and sold. So $8 is spent on the good in question. But notice on the demand curve, so we're taking this as sort of linear, which is why it looks stair-stepped here. The first customer valued the good at $8. So they paid $2 for it. They valued it at $8. So they got $6 of consumer surplus for that. The second customer valued the good at $6. And they only paid $2 as well. So they got $4 of surplus there. The third customer valued the good at $4, and they only paid $2 for it. So they get $2 of consumer surplus there. And then the fourth customer valued it at 2 and paid 2, so they got no surplus. Keep in mind the word surplus, we're talking about sort of excess or extra. They got no surplus, that fourth customer. They paid exactly their valuation of the good. But the first 3 customers got a total of $12 surplus. In other words, they would be willing to pay an additional $12 for the good of their own free will. They value it at that higher level. They're very happy that they're only paying $2, but they would gladly pay another $12 and volunteer to do that. And so you can start, consumer surplus, we want to try and get at some of that money. So here's the non-discrete case. Consumer surplus is sort of this area, and I don't know why the shapes got all funny under here. It's this triangle sort of under here. When we go from the discrete case where there's 4 customers to the continuous case where there's thousands of customers, those sorts of things. But same idea. It's that area under there. That's really what we're after with with price discrimination. Okay, so most of the stuff we've looked at in terms of game theory, in terms of firm behavior, has been talking about a single price. However, there are lots of opportunities. Now, we'll go through the conditions necessary, but there are lots of opportunities for firms to charge multiple prices. And these prices are still going to be these to try and convince you how these modules all tie together. The rule that we talked about when we talked about elasticity in the demand module, where we talked about how firms are going to price, that's going to come back into play right here in terms of price discrimination. Okay, so here's how we're going to define price discrimination. We're going to say price discrimination is the business practice of selling the same good at different prices to different customers, even though the cost for producing the good for the 2 customers are the same. Now, based on media, based on culture, based on habit, we tend to see the word discrimination and we tend to come up with some pretty ugly things. We think bigotry, racist, sexism, all of these things. In this case, discrimination doesn't carry those connotations. We don't tend to like those different types of discrimination, racial discrimination, those things, because they're based on like an arbitrary characteristic. You can't control your gender or your race, these sorts of things, and if you're discriminating based on it, it's kind of unfair. Well, price discrimination, we're not going to be discriminating based on race, gender, those things. That would be unfair. But instead, what we're going to discriminate on is your value of the good, which you do have control over, and you can choose whether to buy it or not. So try not to get all the sort of negative stereotypes with discrimination here. That's not what we're talking about here. We're charging different prices, not based on an arbitrary characteristic, but instead based on the customer's value of the good in question. Okay, so let's try and apply our pricing rule from the elasticity module or the demand module to this last sort of sentence here. In general, the group of customers with the more inelastic demand will be charged. So what we said when we did demand was if demand is inelastic, we're going to raise price. If demand's elastic, we're going to lower price. And if demand's unelastic, revenue's maximized. That's what our rule was when we were doing that module. So let's apply that here. If demand is inelastic, so in this case, if we have a group of customers with a more inelastic demand, they're going to receive a higher price. The group with a more elastic demand is going to receive the lower price. So when the firm is charging different prices to different groups, whichever group is most inelastic is going to get the higher price, and whatever group is more elastic is going to get the lower price. Okay, so what's necessary? Why, we don't see every firm price discriminate. There's lots that don't. There's some that do, but there's lots that don't. There's probably more that don't. So what do you need? Okay, you need consumers to differ in their sensitivity to price, elasticity. So you need customer differences. Now, that's probably true of about every firm. Okay, so that's not the hang up for why some firms don't price discriminate. You need arbitrage to not be possible. So you need it so that consumers can't buy the good and then resell it. So a stereotypical example of price discrimination is like movie theaters. Movie theaters charge one price for matinee, one price for evening, one price for students, one price for adults. They have all these different prices for different groups, and we'll come back to that example later. But they mark on the ticket what time the movie's for, whether it's a student ticket, those sorts of things. Now, how closely they check those, who knows? But they mark the tickets. Same thing with airlines. Airlines price discriminate. Everyone on the airplane probably paid a little bit different price, but your name's on the ticket. So I can't go and get a low price and then take my ticket and turn around and sell it to someone else. And then the hardest part is we need to be able to identify our customers. We need to be able to figure out who's the inelastic customer, who's the elastic customer. That's often hard to do by just looking at people. So when you find examples of price discrimination, we'll go through a bunch of them. That's usually the hang up, is you've got to be able to sort of identify the different groups. Okay, so some examples, and I'll post information about most of these on Blackboard. Apple's pricing. So if you go to Apple's website and you look for, say, a MacBook or an iPad or something like that, you get one price if you just go to their website. You get a second price if you go to their educational website, where you have to be a student or related to, K through 12 or higher education. You get a different price. It's, like $100 cheaper usually. That's price discrimination. You're charging one price to one group and one price to another group. Yield management, which is common in hotels, airlines, those sorts of things. You charge different prices to different customers based on the days they're staying, the days they're traveling, those sorts of things, to try and make sure that you're not flying plane across the country with no one on board. The internet, I'll post several readings on this because this is becoming a bigger and bigger deal, like Amazon using your search history to tailor prices to you, and should they be able to do that without your consent, given that you don't necessarily know they're doing that. But information on the internet and the ability to price discriminate is kind of a hot button issue. And then, as I mentioned before, movies, you see that commonly with movies. So for the remainder of this video, I want to focus on one type of price discrimination, which is sort of the ideal from a business's perspective, but in practice is pretty hard to implement. So first degree price discrimination is when the seller is able to extract all consumer surplus. In order to do that, they have to charge each and every customer their own unique tailored price that's equal to their own willingness to pay. So if you think about that graph we did a few slides back, that first customer that valued it at 8 gets charged 8. The next customer that values it at 6 gets charged 6. The next customer that values it at 4 gets charged 4. And you can see where I'm going with this. Everyone gets their own unique price, which obviously it's hard to have that much information about people to know what the right price is. So often this is called perfect price discrimination, and in all but a couple contexts, it's mostly theoretical. I'll show you sort of how you can mimic it in a way, and I'll give you a couple examples of where it maybe applies, but it's a pretty darn high bar to get first degree or perfect price discrimination, because you'd have to be able to charge each customer their own price equal exactly to their willingness to pay. So two examples of where you can see maybe first degree price discrimination: car dealers. So the assumption there is it's unlikely that if you had, let's say, 10 people walk in and they all wanted the same car, it's unlikely they're going to pay the exact same price. It's dependent on how willing they are to negotiate and how strong they are at negotiating, and all kinds of factors. So everyone's getting sort of a different price depending on those things. Still probably not perfect price discrimination, but it's getting close. I mean, customers are definitely getting sort of their own unique price. And you could see that with some of the apps that deal with car sales. They'll show you like a histogram of different prices for the vehicle you're looking at. And you can get a sense of people are charged all kinds of different prices for the same vehicle. Another one that you guys have some familiarity with: higher education. So when people apply to college, they fill out FAFSA forms, they fill out all this information on their application and on financial aid forms. And then that gets put into an algorithm, and that algorithm spits out what they're going to be willing to pay, or what they estimate they'll be willing to pay to still show up. And so everyone gets sort of a little bit different financial aid package, trying to sort of price discriminate there. Again, it won't work if they can resell it, and transaction costs, information. It's tough to do, but it's possible. Or it's possible to get close. Let's put it that way. And there's actually a scheme that you might be familiar with that comes close to kind of mimicking this in a way. Okay, so let's talk about two-part pricing here. So let's talk about a specific example. So let's suppose that you're in Spokane and you own a microbrewery and you sell your beer in a bar attached to your brewery. Okay, so we go out, we estimate your demand curve. If we multiply your demand curve by quantity, we get your total revenue, which is here. And if we take the derivative of that, and you don't need to worry about taking the derivative, but there's the derivative, which is your marginal revenue. You have a total cost that is here, and you have a marginal cost that's here. Okay, so this is all just going to set up how we can talk about two-part pricing. So just bear with me through the math here. Okay, so what should you do if you're just charging one price? Okay, well, you're going to produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So that's like a principles of econ rule to maximize profits. So from the previous slide, if we set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, you're going to produce 10 units. If we then plug that 10 into your demand equation, we can get your optimal price. Okay, so on the next slide, we can show this graphically in terms of what's going on. Okay, so here's our graph. You're charging a price of 15. You're selling 10 units. Your profit is right here. And your costs, or sorry, not your costs, the consumer surplus is up here. So that's money that consumers are getting, that price discrimination you want to try and capture. Okay, so you see that $50 out there. You see your profit of $90 and you think, I'd like to find a way to kind of capture some of that. So what if, instead of just charging $5 per pint of beer or whatever the increment happens to be, what if we institute a two-part pricing? So here's how that might look. Okay, so after some time operating your bar, you find that you're very popular and have long lines. What would happen if you put in a cover charge, an entrance fee to get at the door to get in? Okay, and in particular, so let's say, I mean, it doesn't represent one person, but let's say that previous graph represented one person. If it represents one person, that person has $50 of consumer surplus. So they would be willing to pay an extra $50 for their beer. So if you charge them a cover charge of $50, they'd pay it. They'd then come in and they'd buy beer, and they'd still buy the same quantity and all that sort of stuff. And you would perfect price discriminate, and you would capture their consumer surplus. Now, it's not one customer, it's multiple customers, but you get the idea there. You charge a cover charge, and you capture some of that consumer surplus. But here's the kicker, but it's intuitive when you think about it. If you go with this approach and you start charging an entrance fee at the door, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to lower price. Okay, so that price we found before, you're going to want to start to lower price. When you lower price, that increases consumer surplus. Your consumers are getting more value when they're inside the bar, and then you're going to raise cover charge. So they're not independent of one another. The more consumer surplus there is, the higher the cover charge is. If you can raise consumer surplus by lowering the price of your beer, you then turn around and you capture that extra consumer surplus by raising the cover charge. And so through two-part pricing, you're able to capture some of that, and in some cases, it can get close, and it can almost mimic first-degree price discrimination through this two-part pricing, where you charge one price to get in. I mean, think of Costco as a different example. You have to be a member to even get in the doors at Costco. So that you get so much consumer surplus from shopping in Costco, and then they capture some of that consumer surplus through your membership fees yearly. The more consumer surplus you get from being a member, the higher they can charge as a membership fee.